It's very rare in genocidal cases to see statements that are so explicit and widespread and repeated over such a large period of time as what we have found in relation to Gaza.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says the death toll in Gaza is now more than 60,000 people since the start of the war.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Wednesday, 17th of September, 2025. We're bringing you a bonus episode today to look at the UN's bombshell report accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza for the first time. The report was released yesterday by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory, which was set up in 2021 by the UN Human Rights Council.
The Commission concluded that Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza and that it is continuing with that genocide.
The report found that Israel had carried out 4 of the 5 genocidal acts defined by the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The report also accused Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, and former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant of having incited the commission of genocide, a separate crime. We're going to be speaking to one of the authors of that report to unpick how his team came to their conclusions and address some of the criticisms. But first, a quick recap, because this is not the first time that Israel has been accused of genocide in this war. In 2023, South Africa filed a case at the International Court of Justice against Israel, accusing it of conduct in Gaza that was tantamount to genocide. That case is ongoing and not due to reach a conclusion for several years. In April this year, Amnesty International accused Israel of genocide. It was joined in July by 2 leading human rights organisations based in Israel, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights. And in September, the International Association of Genocide Scholars also accused Israel of genocide, although we should point out that only 28% of members actually voted. However, this is significant because this is the first official statement from the UN. This was the response from Daniel Meron, Israel's ambassador to the UN.
Israel categorically rejects the libelous rant published today by this Commission of Inquiry. It spreads the malicious genocide narrative. The report diverges from the mandate of the Commission, yet again stressing their biased analysis. Throughout the 72 pages of this paper that the COI presented, the COI promotes a narrative serving Hamas and its supporters in attempting to delegitimize and demonize the State of Israel. The report falsely accuses Israel of genocidal intent, an allegation it cannot substantiate, and even by its cherry-picked data. So, is he right? To answer that, I'm joined down the line by one of the report's authors. Chris Sidoti is a human rights law expert and a lawyer. And interviewing him with me is our global health reporter, Lilia Sebouai, who's been looking at the story as well. Chris, welcome to Battlelines. Could you just start by explaining the legal definition of genocide and how that might differ from how people might think of it in sort of ordinary speak?
Yeah, it's an important issue because we're a body that works on legal definitions. The legal definition of genocide came from World War II. In fact, the principal author of it was a well-known international lawyer from Poland, Raphael Lemkin, who happens to have been Jewish and a survivor of the Holocaust. And at the end of World War II, he was gravely concerned at what had happened, and he hoped that he could devise a way in which this would never happen again. And so he defined genocide. That definition found its way into the Genocide Convention and is now accepted globally as part of international customary law, whether or not a state has ratified the Genocide Convention. Like criminal law generally, it deals both with acts and with intents. And the hard part is the intent part. The convention has 5 categories of genocidal act, and there are particular issues with the intent. Our report found that in relation to the fighting in Gaza, Israel's military policies, 4 of the 5 categories of act had been committed, and we also found the necessary genocidal intent.
Would you mind just giving us some concrete examples, some concrete stories that you heavily corroborated, as you say, just for each of those four categories? If we could start with killing, a story that's stuck with you from the reporting that you guys did.
One of the killings that is particularly arresting is the one that received a great deal of publicity, of the young girl who died with her relatives after the car in which they were travelling was shot up by the Israeli forces. And then the two paramedics in an ambulance who were coming to try to assist them and were also shot and killed. Now, in that case, there were 2 adults and I think 5 children who were killed. And one of the most distressing parts of the death of the child, Hind Rajab, was that she was on a phone talking to the emergency service for 3 or 4 hours while she was dying and while the bullets were still firing, seeking help. We also investigated in this report, we hadn't done it previously, the events of a few months ago when around 18 humanitarian workers were killed. They'd been in a convoy, and it was a complex story where first an ambulance was shot up and then a convoy went to provide rescue and they were shot up, and a later rescue vehicle was also shot up. There was no fighting going on in the vicinity. 18 humanitarian workers were killed, and then there was a deliberate attempt to hide the evidence, not only by burying the bodies, but by burying the ambulances and the vehicles in which they had been travelling. Now, all that came out because, fortunately, there were a couple of eyewitnesses who saw what was happening and reported it. Now, our work would involve interviewing eyewitnesses, looking at all of the digital evidence. You may recall that one of the humanitarian workers had been recording events on his phone prior to being killed himself. So there we had a significant digital record as well as photographic evidence, eyewitness accounts, satellite imagery, and so forth. We were able to determine that there was no other military activity taking place in the vicinity, and this had been unprovoked firing on and assassination of humanitarian workers. So both of these instances, it's only 2, and it's only here I'm talking less than 25 out of at least 65,000 people who have been killed. But these are the kinds of incidents that when they occur multiple times over this period of fighting, time and time again, can only lead to a conclusion that this is intentional. You can only put so much down to incompetence before you have to say, is this incompetence so widespread that the Israeli army is the most incompetent in the world? Or is the truth in the alternative view that these were deliberate killings? And this pattern is so widespread, we could come to no other conclusion.
And if we go on to the second one, what are some concrete examples for causing serious bodily or mental harm?
The serious bodily and mental harm is caused by the kinds of circumstances that I have described. But here our focus is very much on the consequences. The extraordinary number of children who have had one or more limbs amputated because of their injury. I'm not a scholar of all wars, but those who are say that in living memory, there has not been a war in which so many people have lost limbs. And there has not been a war in which so many children have lost one or both parents. The number of orphans, and being an orphan in Gaza is made worse, aggravated by the fact that so many members of families have been killed, that it's no longer the case of losing a parent or losing 2 parents and grandparents will take you in, or aunties and uncles. In many situations, the child survivor has no surviving relatives, and yet it is extraordinarily badly injured. These are physical and psychological injuries that will last for life. A child with an amputated limb may be able to get a prosthetic. Not now. That anything like that, any kind of medical treatment is almost non-existent, but perhaps in time. But a prosthetic limb cannot replace the original limb. It is a make-do, and no amount of caring can replace a parent. The numbers of injuries are extraordinary. And the devastation of Gaza is so overwhelming that we are only beginning to imagine the long-term psychological impact. So that's the second limb.
I think those first two, a lot of people might have a sort of common sense reaction to, almost from just seeing and reading the news. It's clear a lot of people have been killed and a lot of people have been injured. The third one is perhaps where things start to get a bit stickier, trickier for people, perhaps particularly if they're not versed in the law, about deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of the Palestinians in whole or part. How do you go about proving that?
We look in that area principally at physical things. Imagine the kinds of things that you rely on for your life. Food, water, healthcare when you need it, medicines, hospitals, schools and universities, teachers, doctors, nurses, the ability to exercise culture or religious belief like mosques, churches, museums, archaeological sites, libraries, even roads, housing. How hard is it for a human being to live with no shelter and no housing? As recently as last weekend, we saw every day, before and after the weekend and throughout the weekend, high-rise residential towers being deliberately exploded. And the Israeli military was openly bragging of this, each day showing videos of the deliberate destruction of residential accommodation. Now, these kinds of physical things are what we mean by provisions for conditions of life to enable human life to exist. It's not something fancy or intangible. It's food, water, fuel, electricity. It's housing, education and health. And there has been, for 2 years, the deliberate destruction of this entire infrastructure of human society in the Gaza Strip.
And then if we get on to the imposing measures intended to prevent births.
The most serious example of that is one that we reported on quite extensively in March this year. And it concerned Gaza's largest fertility clinic and facility. There are a number, like many towns or cities, a number of facility services in Gaza, but one was far, far bigger than any of the others. It was a full building. It was clearly marked as a medical facility. It was clearly marked as a reproductive centre, fertility clinic. And it was destroyed as a service, a building, but also all of the reproductive materials were destroyed. There was one or more, possibly 2 or 3, tank shells that were deliberately fired into the clinic, targeted at the part of the clinic where the reproductive material was stored and where there were nitrogen tanks, known to be so because you needed nitrogen tanks to be able to maintain the temperature. 4,000 fertilized embryos were destroyed and 1,000 items of other reproductive material, so sperm and unfertilized eggs. And this was the result of direct shelling by tanks. And at the same time, our forensic work indicated that there was no fighting going on in the area, and also that indicated that neighbouring buildings had suffered some damage, but nothing like the amount of damage that the fertility clinic had received, indicating that the fertility clinic was the area that was targeted. And it was specifically targeted and more than any other buildings in the area. That's the principal example. But we also noted that when hospitals were attacked, and virtually, well, not even virtually, every hospital in Gaza has been attacked during the course of the last 2 years. And the attacks generally targeted different areas. But it was very common that the attacks on hospitals targeted maternity wards and neonatal wards. So, and coupled with it too, the deprivation of the essential medical equipment like humidity cribs for the maintenance of life of neonatal babies. These humidity cribs were not provided. Neonatal wards were destroyed. Maternity wards were destroyed. So the principal example is the destruction of the fertility clinic, but it's not unique.
There's a final category about transfer of children, but I understand you guys found no evidence of that.
This is not an issue in relation to Gaza. So we found 4 of the 5 categories, and these categories are each independent. We don't have to find them all to constitute genocide. You only have to find one, and we found 4.
The Commission concluded that genocidal intent is the only reasonable inference from the totality of the evidence. There's been suggestions that this could be picked apart. If we look at the Rwanda genocide, for example, there was concrete documentary evidence there. With Israel, is relying on inflammatory statements the main thing that reached this conclusion? And is that enough?
That's one part, but it's not the totality. This is certainly the hardest question in genocide, proving genocidal purpose. And it's one of the reasons why there are only a few cases of genocide that have been established over the last 25 years. The first genocide trials related to Rwanda, and since then there have been others, but still not an enormous number. And genocidal intent is the hard thing because it's a hard factor to establish. We have relied on 2 quite independent and quite convincing areas. The first is the direct evidence, and that is the statements that have been made. It's very rare in genocidal cases to see statements that are so explicit and widespread and repeated over such a large period of time as what we have found in relation to Gaza. It started on the 7th of October, and it's continuing. And the statements have been made by large numbers of senior political and military leaders. It's not just 1 or 2 lunatics on the side who have no influence on the process. It is the people who are the key decision makers, occupying the most senior positions in the military and in the government. And they weren't just statements made in the heat of the moment on the 7th of October, when everyone in Israel was so highly traumatized, and understandably so. 2 years later, we're still finding people, sometimes the same people, sometimes new people in the same positions, making the same statements. And it's not just the statements, but the fact that the statements are acted upon. If it was just statements, it may be incitement to genocide, it may be hate speech, but when the statements are acted upon, and when the people making the statements are in positions of command such that their orders are implemented, then you have proof of genocidal intent. But that's not the only thing. The second area is the question of the pattern of conduct, the pattern of operations that we have seen over the last 2 years. You know, I've described the genocidal acts, and the evidence that we collected and verified that established the genocidal acts is also evidence that establishes genocidal intent, because they were so widespread. They persisted for such a long period of time. There is so much evidence. It can't be just said that these were the unauthorized acts by individual soldiers who may be mad or who may be murderers. These things are so widespread, so consistent, and they have persisted for 2 years that they have to be seen as part of the standard operating procedures of the Israeli military forces. And this whole pattern of conduct has persisted for 2 years. We identified in our very first reports on Gaza in June 2024 that the nature of the warfare being undertaken by the Israeli military inevitably was leading to hundreds and then thousands of deaths. It was the inevitable result of running a war on this basis. And we gave warning then that this was a war crime and could be more serious. And others have done the same. The arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court are an indicator of concern about war crimes. But there has been no shift of strategy, no shift of operational methodology. After 2 years, it continues. And the greatest, for me, the greatest indicator of genocidal intent is that 2 million people have no way to escape from the slaughter being imposed, from the starvation. In this, the Gaza war is unique in current memory. When there was war in Rwanda, the genocide there, the Tutsi were able to flee to Burundi and to Uganda and to Congo. During the Yugoslav war, the Bosnians went to Croatia or to Slovenia. During the war in Syria, millions went to Turkey and to Lebanon, and many of them, around 1 million, went to Europe. During the war in Ukraine, some 5 or 6 million Ukrainians, perhaps more, crossed the border into Poland and then to Germany and then elsewhere in Western Europe. Gaza is unique in that mass slaughter and mass starvation are being inflicted, have been inflicted for a period of 2 years, and 2 million people have no means of escape. All they can do is sit there and take it. Now, if that's not genocide, what is?
How do you factor in the Israeli army issuing evacuation orders and, advance warnings and providing
Evacuations to where?
to their humanitarian zones, such as Al Mawasi, which I know has been attacked as well?
Well, even the word humanitarian zone is a cruel joke. It's a hoax. Our investigations indicated that people were being targeted and shot along the evacuation routes, and targeted and bombed when they were in the so-called humanitarian zones, in schools, in hospitals, in tents, on beaches. They were killed. The United Nations officials have said repeatedly, people on the ground, there is no safe place in Gaza. If the Israelis were concerned to avoid genocide, if they were concerned about true humanitarian zones, they would enable the people of Gaza to seek refuge in Israel itself. Sure, with security, sure, with checks on the borders and everything else, but without a means of escape, there is literally a captive population upon whom genocide is inflicted. That's what it is.
I just want to run through the Israeli government's response to your report. They've called the authors, yourself and your 2 co-authors, Hamas proxies. It said the report relies entirely on Hamas falsehoods. It's accused your committee of anti-Semitism, as well as the UN Human Rights Committee, which commissioned your commission. What do you say to that? What's your response?
Look, there are 2 issues here. The first is a total joke, and the second is very, very serious. The total joke is that the Israeli government spins out this garbage all the time, and no one believes it anymore. I hope you two don't believe it. They just spin it out. It's got to the point where I'm pretty well convinced that this is being produced by artificial intelligence, because it's the same stuff wrapped around in the same language every single time. That's a joke. And I can't take it seriously. But there is one thing that is very serious. Anti-Semitism is very serious. Anti-Semitism has been around in Europe for 1,000 years, and literally millions of people have died as a result of anti-Semitism. And the Holocaust continues to be a memory in the living memories of people. It is no joke. It is very serious. And this kind of garbage coming out of the Israeli government, the most serious thing of all is that it trivializes anti-Semitism. It says that anybody who says anything ever critical of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. Now, anti-Semitism is too important, too serious to be treated as a joke and trivialized like that. And I don't give a damn about most of what they say, but I care deeply about their suggestions, their trivialization of anti-Semitism.
We're aware that one of the fellow authors, Maloon Kathari's comments in an interview earlier this year, where he suggested that social media was largely controlled by the Jewish lobby. He has since apologised for those remarks, but do you think that this undermines your report? We also noticed he wasn't at the press conference this morning.
Maloon Kathari didn't say that earlier this year. He said it many years ago. And he's not been actively involved in the work of the Commission for some time now.
So there were issues with anti-Semitism then around him, which could be used to discredit your reporting?
Well, the very least about it is that his comments were completely inappropriate. Whether they were in fact motivated by anti-Semitism, I can't say, but they were inappropriate, and he hasn't played a role in the commission for some time.
It's a problem, isn't it? Because you're right, anti-Semitism is really serious. And it's one of the very serious charges that Israel repeatedly hurls at the UN itself. Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, your report today, UN bodies that have reported on atrocities in Gaza. And it's one that our readers here at the Telegraph and our listeners continuously come back to, that they find it hard to believe anything that comes out of the UN because they think it's tarnished by anti-Semitism. I mean, how do you respond to that? How can you respond to that?
No, I can respond to it, and I can respond to it by saying that these allegations trivialise anti-Semitism. Let's get real. There are anti-Semites in the world. The Secretary General of the United Nations? Come on. This is just nonsense. And I regret to say that some of those who spread this nonsense do so intentionally to avoid engaging with the evidence, to avoid having to justify their actions, and as a diversionary tactic, that is, they throw these allegations around to escape accountability for their own actions. And to me, that is reprehensible.
We mentioned it earlier, but how were testimonies and evidence used in the report verified, especially given that access to Gaza has been extremely limited? Many sources are anonymous.
And also the fact that Israel didn't participate in your commission's reporting, right? Did you feel that there was important information missing?
Two really pertinent points to raise. Firstly, we don't collect and we do not act on anonymous evidence. Evidence may be anonymous when we release it. That is, we do not release the names of people or their identities when there is a risk of danger to them. That would be a fundamental violation of our principles. But we do not rely in any way on evidence that is anonymous, and we do not make any findings without corroboration. There are many instances where information comes to us that, I guess if we apply the law of probabilities, is highly likely to be correct, and sometimes can be considered very credit-worthy. But if it's not corroborated, we do not accept and act upon it. So whatever we say that we have found, we are absolutely confident is correct. But there is a lot more that we know that we do not have the necessary degree of corroboration to make a finding on. Second question, yes, Israel has obstructed our investigations. That's pretty much standard practice amongst perpetrators of human rights atrocities. I'd previously been on a similar commission of inquiry looking at Myanmar, and we were excluded from access to Myanmar. We could not go into the country, we could not investigate in the country, and yet we produced very extensive reports. About the only country in recent years that has accepted a UN commission of inquiry has been Ukraine, and that's largely because that commission of inquiry is looking at the actions of Russia in Ukraine. So it's common practice. In the past, it really did cause grave difficulties. But the difficulties caused these days are limited, and limited to one important area that I'll come back to. They're only limited because we still have hundreds or thousands of people who are witnesses that we can talk to. In the case of Myanmar, there were 1 million people, Rohingya, in the camps in Cox's Bazar that we could speak to who were eyewitnesses. There are many people who have left Gaza, medical evacuees, the families of medical evacuees. I mentioned the foreign doctors and nurses and other humanitarian workers who have been in there on the ground. We can talk directly to witnesses outside Gaza, and we can also talk by phone or internet where people can charge their batteries to those who are still inside Gaza. And we have all the digital evidence that I have mentioned already. That was not available 20 or 30 years ago, but is now available in copious volumes. And in this case, often people are incredibly proud of their crimes. We saw a lot of video evidence produced by the Hamas militants on the 7th of October. And on the basis of that video evidence and corroborating evidence, we found that Hamas had committed war crimes. And the Israeli soldiers post some of the most outrageous material on social media, and we were able to collect and analyse that. So we've got that evidence as well. I mentioned one area where there is particular difficulty, and that difficulty is, for us, conducting investigations inside the State of Israel. When Israel obstructs our investigation, refuses to provide us with any evidence to support its case, simply makes bald, bold assertions of situations, doesn't give us access, for example, to doctors who conducted autopsies after the 7th of October, doesn't allow us to interview witnesses of 7th of October, doesn't even allow us to interview soldiers who have been accused of war crimes in Gaza. To the extent to which our investigation is in any way impeded, we are impeded in hearing the evidence that Israel would want us to hear to provide some justification for its case. And so many of our conclusions in relation to 7 October were tentative conclusions. Some were very firm, some were very tentative. But we have tons of evidence, literally, about what has happened in Gaza over the last 2 years.
You mentioned October 7th, but it's mentioned quite glancingly in the report. Doesn't that undermine a bit, given the debate that we know will be had over it all?
Look, my answer is no, it doesn't undermine the report, because the report is looking at what has happened in Gaza over the last 2 years, and there is one good reason why we have done that, and that is because it's continuing. It is still going on. What happened on October 7 finished on October 8, and that's not in any way to minimise it. As I've said already today in talking to you, we reported on what happened on October 7-8. I have to say that our report on what happened on 7-8 October is more comprehensive than any report produced by the Israeli authorities. Any report from the government or the military on what happened on those days by the Israeli authorities is partial and far less comprehensive, far less detailed, and far less informative than the report that we produced. So we want to come back to it, but we need more evidence to be able to come back to it. But in the meantime, it's Gaza where people are continuing to die at the rate of 80 to 100 every day. That is, within a 2-week period, there are more people killed in Gaza every 2 weeks than what were killed in Israel at the bottom on the days of October 2023. So we focused on Gaza because that's where it is happening. But war crimes were committed on the 7th and 8th of October. We have reported on that, and that remains part of our mandate and our concern.
And if we look at what next now, what are the real-world consequences of declaring that a genocide's occurred? And is the accusation a form of political pressure rather than just a legal finding?
Well, for us, it's first and foremost a legal finding, but I accept that political pressure will arise from it as well. It's a legal finding because we're a legal body. Our work is based on law, and our processes are standard legal processes of fact-finding and application of law. So it is a legal finding, and for that reason, it's a finding that will be of assistance, we hope, to international and domestic courts that are pursuing accountability issues. It will also be of relevance to United Nations bodies, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly. I'm not so naive as to think that the Security Council will care one way or the other, but it will be a report that has an impact on the General Assembly of the Human Rights Council. To me, its most important immediate impact must be on individual national governments. A finding of genocide is a finding that emphasises the existing legal obligations under international law on states to act to prevent genocide and to punish genocide. It's seemed as though for the last 2 years, many states have hidden behind the excuse of, we have to wait for a court decision before we can identify genocide. Well, there is a court decision already, the interim orders issued by the International Court of Justice, that indicated in January last year a grave risk or a plausible risk of genocide. Now, at least then, the obligations on all states were triggered that genocide is a risk and there must be action to prevent it. My hope, my expectation, is that this report, by emphasising our finding that genocide has occurred and is continuing to occur, my hope is that this finding, this report, will encourage and in the end motivate states, instigate action by states to honour their existing international legal obligations. So I think individual states and groups of states like the EU, the African Union, the Organisation of American States, these individual states and groups of states are, for me, the primary targets of this report.
Chris Sidoti, thank you very much for joining us on Battlelines. That's all for today's episode of Battlelines. We'll be back again on our normal schedule on Friday. Until then, goodbye. Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Peter Shevlin. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.